This is Living Planet. I'm Kathleen Schuster. Today we have a special bonus episode for you. In December, we were talking about what we're getting wrong about protein. And if you didn't hear that episode, you can scroll back through our podcast feed. Our reporter Jennifer Collins was the brains behind that particular episode, and she joins me now because she says there's an update. So Jen, thanks for joining us. How are things in Berlin?
Hey, Kathleen. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. It's pretty cold here in Berlin. But apparently things are getting pretty heated in the US when it comes to food, I hear.
Okay, Jen, I'm going to need a hint about what you're talking about exactly.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you a post on Instagram, and I just want you to describe what you see in it.
Okay, so it's a shadowy picture of U.S. Health Secretary RFK Jr., and it says, "We are ending the war on protein." And I see one of the first comments is, since when was there a war on protein? Which is actually kind of one of my questions.
Yeah, I genuinely didn't realize there was a war on protein. I mean, this war was happening completely without my knowledge because every time, and I don't know if you've experienced this, every time I open my social media, I'm just bombarded with posts telling me I'm not eating enough protein and that I need something like 200 grams a day, and that if I don't lift weights, my old lady body is just basically going to fall apart. It's nonstop.
But okay, so that explains why you did the episode back in December about protein. And today you wanted to give us an update about this supposed war on protein. And I really want to emphasize supposed because, considering the state of the world right now and actual war is going on, we're not making light of that term. But this is what they're calling it, a war on protein. So what exactly is going on?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's all kind of part of the, you mentioned the U.S. Health Secretary there, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and his Make America Healthy Again movement, I guess you can call it. But his department has just released some new dietary guidelines for Americans that, on the surface at least, seem to flip the traditional kind of food pyramid.
Yeah, I saw that. So it's literally, for listeners who haven't seen it, they've taken the food pyramid and literally flipped it upside down so that the main foods that you should be getting are at the very top. And now there's a big fat steak at the top. I mean, next to vegetables, but I just have to pull this up again to look at it because, the images are obviously not to scale, like the turkey and the broccoli are next to each other and they're the same size, which is clearly off. But it's like red meat and it literally says whole milk. So really pushing kind of animal-based products that are also filled with saturated fat. And this just seems surprising because it seems to go against what used to be recommended, at least when I was growing up.
Yeah, and, this is what the U.S. Health Secretary RFK Jr. had to say about that change.
Protein and healthy fats are essential and were wrongly discouraged in prior dietary guidelines. We are ending the war on saturated fats.
The other thing in the guidelines is that they have upped the minimum daily protein intake. They've doubled it. Some of the experts I spoke to, just to kind of give a little taster, say that most people are getting enough protein. That's maybe a bit of a spoiler, but we also talked about that in the last episode. And, having more protein or the focus on animal-based protein probably isn't the best for the health of the planet.
Right. And so in this episode, we're going to unpack that claim. We're also going to take a closer look at what this could mean for Americans' health and also the health of the planet. Before we get started, if you have any questions about this episode or feedback for us, you can leave Living Planet a recorded voice message. It's super easy and fast. Just go to dw.com/livingplanet. You don't have to download anything or sign in. All you have to do is hit record. That's dw.com/livingplanet. We can't wait to hear from you. Now back to the show. Okay, Jen, first things first. Has the U.S. really been experiencing a quote-unquote war on protein?
So, Kathleen, I'm going to err on the side of no. The protein market has really been booming for years. And, whether that's protein supplements or plant-based protein or animal-derived protein, sales of meat and dairy products are really, really strong. So, in 2025 last year, in the US, red meat sales alone were expected to hit more than $76 billion. So one expert I spoke to about the new dietary guidelines was Dr. Bettina Mittendorfer. She's a professor of medicine and nutrition and exercise physiology at the University of Missouri. And one of Bettina's main research areas is protein. She said this new push for protein was
actually quite interesting because the message that we get, I think, the perception is, and I hear this all the time talking to colleagues or like friends and stuff too, is like that sense is that we don't eat enough of it and we need to eat more, when really the data is there that the vast majority of people in Western countries eat already what the new recommendation is.
So she emphasises that no food is inherently bad, but that in the West, we generally overconsume. And that just means we get enough protein almost by default, because there's much more food around compared to, say, 60 or 70 years ago when scientists were really worried about a lack of protein and undernutrition.
Right. And you said the U.S. government is now recommending up to 1.6 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. So that's double what it used to be. And just to give an example for people who aren't necessarily thinking in terms of kilos or pounds, so a woman who weighs, say, 62 kilos, that would be 138 pounds. So that particular woman, according to these guidelines, could need up to 100 grams of protein a day. And that's not even taking her level of activity into account. And I can just say on a personal note, I've tried to reach 100 grams of protein a day. It is really hard.
Yeah, and so Bettina Mittendorfer, she also pointed out that a certain level of protein could be too much. But before we hear about that, it's more important to talk about how animal-based protein has reshaped the food market. So if you take something like protein powder, let's say, that's really huge now. If you go into the supermarket, there's just aisles of protein, added protein foods and protein powders, that kind of thing. And whey-based protein powder really dominates there. So whey is high in protein, but it used to be a low-value leftover of cheese making. So the stuff you'd kind of spread on fields or feed to pigs. But today it's a real moneymaker for dairy farmers. So with demand skyrocketing, the market is projected to double in size by 2033.
Okay, so if there was a quote-unquote war, it sounds like protein was always winning.
Exactly. I mean, plant-based options like so-called fake meat burgers have even hit a slump in recent years because veganism has kind of gone out of trend a little bit and meat eating has made a bit of a comeback.
I'm going to show you 4 foods that are absolutely destroying your testosterone levels, and that is soy products. There's a reason that the term soy boy exists.
And that's really been helped along by meatfluencers, as they're called, and just a wider push to eat more protein.
Studies in men have shown that if man stops eating meat, saturated fats in particular, his testosterone plummets, his sperm production plummets.
Okay, so how does that all relate back to the new U.S. dietary guidelines and, more importantly, the environment?
So what we're seeing here, I would say, from the US Health Department under President Donald Trump's administration is just really a very specific story being told about food. That ultra-processed food is linked to chronic diseases, which is true if you eat too much of it. But also they say meat and protein has been unfairly maligned by experts, bureaucrats and climate scientists, that previous guidelines were undermined by bad science and that the new guidelines are just finally correcting that mistake. So in this framing, eating more meat and animal protein, it's not just about health, it becomes about common sense, personal freedom, and just really pushing back against that quote-unquote woke trend that favours diets with more plant protein that are also better for the planet,
Jen, could you give us an example?
Yeah, so one thing that RFK Jr. mentions that I found really interesting that are in the guidelines, it's that because of Americans' current diets,
77% of military-aged Americans are ineligible for military service because of diet-related conditions. If a foreign adversary sought to destroy the health of our children, to cripple our economy, to weaken our national security, there would be no better strategy than to addict us to ultra-processed foods. It's shocking that our own government helped to drive these cataclysmic changes in our diet. The damage is real, it is preventable, and President Trump has ordered it to end.
Yeah, that is interesting. That reminds me of reporting that I've read about how recruiters are even having to get involved in encouraging applicants to get in shape first before they can even do basic training because of issues related to high obesity rates.
I mean, there was that drive there recently. I think the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was really pushing this idea that people in the military were out of shape and generals were out of shape. And, you know, but it really ties in with these kind of narratives around masculinity. And another expert I spoke to was Maddie Houghton-Boakes from Changing Markets. She's been researching these narratives around plant-based diets and eating meat online for years. And she says this fits into kind of these stories about vegans being weak and the kind of like, you know, soy boy idea and the notion that you just need to eat meat to be strong.
The kind of meat is masculine narrative is long-standing, and it's part of this kind of carnivore protein bro world that is definitely in the Make America Healthy Again sphere and the Trump sphere. Lots of the misinfluencers that we've been following who promote carnivore diets use this kind of like masculine language and imagery. So yeah, the idea of being kind of war ready is not surprising.
I'm just wondering, do these guidelines really matter? I mean, I remember seeing the food pyramid in school when I was growing up or like at the doctor's office, but do people still pay attention to it anymore?
Well, you know, Maddie points out that these guidelines, you know, they will actually be implemented in some way since they come from the government.
It can have a huge impact on public procurement and particularly schools and military. And I think schools is probably one of the most, is the most worrying one, because the kinds of food that you eat as a child can so often shape your dietary choices and how you approach meals going forwards. And so if it's very much that like the bulk of your plate is taken up with an animal source protein and then you have smatterings of whole grains and vegetables around the outside, that's probably how people are going to think of a meal going forward.
And then another thing that Maddie and others have also noted is that a number of those on the scientific panel who put the new guidelines together have actually disclosed links to the dairy and cattle industry. So that really raises concerns for people about transparency and conflicts of interest. So a previous panel of scientists had actually spent 2 years putting together new dietary recommendations, and they were expected to move protein-rich legumes, beans and peas to a more prominent spot on the pyramid.
Which would have been a real kind of step change in US dietary guidelines. But yeah, we know that the meat and dairy industry has for a long time had a really strong hold on dietary guidelines and other national level decision making around food in America.
I suppose the meat and dairy sectors want to protect their business, which is why they're lobbying. And that seems like kind of a normal reaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, that's what, you know, interests and market players do, right? But I suppose what's really striking is that none of this is really new. You know, not the language, not the strategy. It's the same set of tactics used by the tobacco industry and later by fossil fuel companies whenever scientific evidence or policy changes threaten their business models.
Tell us more about what that playbook looks like.
Yeah, so Maddie divides it into 3 parts.
So first of all, there is distract, and the industry puts forward a number of kind of greenwashing and voluntary commitments in order to distract from their real climate impact.
So livestock agriculture already accounts for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and raising cattle makes up the bulk of that, so 2/3 to be exact. And to clean up that image, the meat industry touts its tech solutions, like adding additives to cattle feed that reduce methane emissions, which is actually a really potent greenhouse gas, though it's not as long-lived as CO2 in the atmosphere.
But their importance is overinflated by the industry, and it is used to distract from the genuine solutions, which would be shifts in our food system, and a number of kind of, you know, voluntary pledges like their net zero commitments from the likes of JBS, the world's biggest meat company. They settled a lawsuit on greenwashing, basically admitting that they had no plan for how they were going to achieve this, and instead they just focused on the PR side and the comms side rather than being evidence-based.
So then there are the delay tactics. So Maddie says these look like getting policymakers to forgo regulation since they've made a pledge, essentially kicking the can down the road. And then finally, derail tactics, like moving people from the industry to government positions that regulate the industry. So that revolving door.
So they go from working for industry to literally setting the policies that will regulate the industry.
Changing Markets did a big piece of research into the online backlash against the Eat Lancet planetary health diet when it came out first in 2019.
Okay, so first, what is the Eat Lancet diet?
So basically, the Eat Lancet Commission is an independent scientific body working with the Lancet. That's a really well-regarded British medical journal. And they recommend eating more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and legumes, and basically significantly less meat, dairy and sugar. They say this is a healthier diet for people and also the planet. And they say if it's widely adopted, it could reduce agricultural emissions of gases like methane and nitrous oxide by about 15% by 2050. And basically the diet is actually kind of similar to, say, something like the Mediterranean diet.
Okay, and what did Changing Markets find when looking into the backlash against this diet?
So they found that industry-friendly scientists, doctors, health influencers, journalists and authors connected with the meat industry took part in a targeted and coordinated campaign to derail the report and its health and sustainability research. They portrayed it as dangerous, elitist and anti-science, and they falsely claimed it reduced recommended protein intake under WHO guidelines. And they also claimed it was pushing a vegan diet, which it's not. It recommends a flexitarian approach. So the research showed how wellness and meat influencers tagged and shared each other's content. So they would use almost identical wording or very similar wording. And then there were hashtags like yes to meat and meat heals and climate food facts to promote the health and environmental benefits of meat. And then during that initial backlash period, they identified about 100 influencers who were responsible for nearly 50% of posts that formed the backlash on X, which was then Twitter. And then over 90% of total engagement as well.
We found a number of accounts who jumped out from the data as being coordinated, but there's a few misinfluencers who are kind of, I would say, more engaged in that. They include Sean Baker, who's this like big carnivore diet promoter. It also includes Frederick Leroy, who is a academic who works on livestock and nutritional benefits of livestock. And then it also includes a few kind of people on the nutrition side and kind of journalists who look at food systems and have talked about food systems for a long time. And coordinating over a shared topic isn't obviously bad. We all do that where we've got a shared kind of interest and engagement on something, but it's that they are coordinating around misinformation.
I can only imagine how confusing that must be to people. You know, on the one hand, you grow up with the information of a certain type of protein, like beef, for example, is something to be consumed in small amounts, if at all. And then now to be told the opposite, like, how are you supposed to know what to believe?
I mean, yeah, it is really confusing. And I guess that's why I did the protein episode and why I've kind of been looking into it a little bit more. And just, I mean, the whole kind of health recommendations around food in general, it's actually quite a difficult thing to parse. So I feel like, you know, it's very easy to just want to throw in the towel. But so Changing Markets and others, they really see the new US dietary guidelines as part of that same pattern of lobbying and you know, narrative shaping.
What we're interested to see is the ramifications this has for the kind of discussion around dietary shift elsewhere on health and also climate grounds. It's probably going to give quite a boost to the meat and dairy industry.
Coming up, we're going to hear from nutrition scientist Bettina Mittendorfer again, who spoke to Jennifer for the episode on protein myths. She gave her thoughts on some listener feedback to that episode and more of her thoughts on the health recommendations in the new U.S. dietary guidelines. Right after this message.
It's tough being German. People think I'm punctual, but I'm often late.
Let's do a quick check of stereotypes.
When you think of Germany, you think of
Extreme punctuality,
perfect planning.
high-tech and efficiency.
Well, think again.
Welcome to Delay Land.
A podcast about a country that needs your help.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
So just to provide some context, Jen, you recently did an episode about the protein craze, what we're getting wrong about protein. And you talked about how much protein we actually need for good health, why animal protein carries such a heavy climate footprint, and also what choices could cut emissions without sacrificing strength and health. But as I understood it, some listeners were not so happy with that episode, right?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't. And look, I get it. Food is just, it's a really emotional thing and it's tied to so much identity and memory. You know, like I mentioned, I'm a vegetarian, but I really miss, for instance, the Irish stew that my granny used to make me when I was a child. And that there was a lot of meat in that. And I just have very strong memories tied with that. So, yeah, I understand people's kind of feelings around it, strong feelings around it. But some felt we were trying to push a vegan diet.
I feel like I should jump in here and just make really clear that on our team, we are not exclusively vegan or vegetarian. I mean, I myself eat meat. I know at least one other person on our team does. It's just kind of, it's part of our job to report on the climate impact of food, among other things. So I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, like we're just looking at kind of what the science says and you know, about the impact of those dietary choices on health and planet. And then, you know, people can make their own decisions then to the best of their ability with the information they have at hand. And even with the Eat Lancet diet and those kind of diets, they're not recommending, you know, a complete switch to veganism. They're just saying, like, this is the impact of this. And if you just eat this other kind of meat or you reduce your meat intake and you increase your plant protein, that's just better for cutting emissions, helping to cut emissions. So, but anyway, we went back to Bettina with some of the comments just to get her take on them. So the first comment was from a Mr. Kruger 88 who said,
"What a biased load of rubbish. The Eat Lancet diet being pushed with its recommended or forced 19 grams of protein a day is nothing but an agenda pushing a plant-based diet disguised as healthy. Just go back to early human studies and see what they ate and what their bodies were built from. The answer is meat from animal products, and their lack of modern-day diseases proves this."
So basically, Bettina says nobody is pushing 19 grams of protein a day.
That's certainly not correct in any way, right? Because that is not enough. That would be something that would be part of per meal. But the whole idea that our ancestors ate meats and everything, I would encourage anyone who makes that comment is compare life expectancy, right? You may have functioned. You may have looked at this person and look, they run around and gather as well, right, and hunt. But what was their life expectancy? Is it all because of the food they ate? Absolutely not. But I think really just because something works, the way it's being treated doesn't necessarily mean it's at optimal function.
And Bettina also pointed out that diets vary across culture, they vary across time, and there's no one kind of past diet that everyone adhered to.
Right. And we also had a comment from @JamesMitchell6242.
Came straight to the comments and knew they would be pushing that protein and animal products are unhealthy. The fact that anyone can believe this is astonishing.
Bettina says from a health perspective,
that's not my take on it at all, right? So if anything, I'm one who I would see the balance. And like I said, there is nothing inherently bad. It's how much of it do you eat? What's the frequency of it, right, that you eat? And what does it replace? So it's the overall makeup. I would not say protein is bad. I don't say meat is bad, right? So I think it's really that take on the emphasis always on that one kind of thing, right? And that makes it difficult. But it's easy to sell. It's easy to make arguments if you focus on one food item, on one nutrient or something like that.
There was another one we wanted to address from Jaghad. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Because it really, related directly to Bettina's field of study.
Rubbish. The whole field of the so-called nutrition science should be scrapped. There is no science in nutrition. It's all a bunch of useless epidemiological studies based on questions.
Well, I would imagine Bettina would disagree with that. Otherwise, she would be out of a job.
Yeah, but she acknowledges that it's also a really difficult field of study because, we don't eat like a single nutrient that then you can study in isolation. We eat foods, we eat combinations of food, we eat diets, but it's not all studies in a lab that just don't translate to the real world. There's a whole interplay of different kinds of studies here.
So this isn't just sort of willy-nilly science. I think as hard as it is to do, there's very strong science to support certain things. And that's really a compilation of basic science, cell-based, just in vitro studies, how cells react to certain nutrients, for instance, but then also very carefully controlled clinical research in people and then population-based studies. And so you get a big rounded picture, and not everything that you conclude from one type of science holds true in the other. But I think that's where the beauty is, that you take everything together and then you come to those conclusions.
So one thing I found really fascinating about this when I spoke to Bettina is the way they run these clinical trials. So they've got scientists who are basically like chefs, and they cook every meal for the participants. So, it's a lab basically disguised as a restaurant, except the dishes are designed to test really specific things like exact protein levels. So that means like the meal isn't really going to look like something you would cook at home or get out in a restaurant, because you might have like an absolutely like giant chunk of meat and like, I don't know, like a tiny bit of potato or something, I don't know. Yeah, but it, it still has to taste good enough that people will actually eat it and, stick with the study.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good to have all your meals cooked. Can I sign up for this somewhere, Jen?
I mean, I would like to as well.
We can go together.
The whole team, the whole Living Planet team.
Yeah. So what did Bettina think overall of the new guidelines, though, apart from the higher protein recommendations?
Yeah, so she did think there were good aspects to them. For instance, that they're like simpler and maybe easier for people to digest, so to speak. And then she thought the emphasis on whole foods, that was good as well. But she basically said that some of the messaging, particularly if you look at the inverted food pyramid, is a bit confusing, and that you could kind of get the impression that you should really up your meat and saturated fat intake with butter and full fat dairy. Even though in the actual, like if you read the guidelines, they're very specific about portions, but, like how many people are reading the guidelines. So yeah, she just kind of flagged, and other people have flagged that, you might get the impression that, yeah, you can eat loads of this. But, she says too much saturated fat is linked to heart disease and high cholesterol.
Yeah. And, I have to say, throughout this entire interview, the thing that's been going through my mind is how I think it was in the 90s in the States. I'm not sure if it started in the 90s or if it was a bit earlier, but there was this diet called the Atkins diet that really advocated for it's basically a low carb diet. But the result that I remember, at least, was a lot of adults who were going really heavy on eating meat and a lot of dairy products and, basically eating what this food pyramid looked like. Now, of course, maybe ill-advised and not really paying attention to the nutritional content of what they were eating. And so I just keep thinking like, okay, what is the difference between then and now? And I think one major difference, and of course, very important to our podcast, is we are talking much more about the environmental impact of these things. And when you think of a country as large as the US, which already has the issue of overconsumption, and then you add to it, telling people like you really need to eat more meat, I do wonder what kind of environmental impact this could have in a country that already eats a lot of meat, So yeah, you've given me a lot of food for thought, Jen, is what I'm trying to say. Forgive the pun.
You're more than welcome. But I think Bettina's main takeaway is really like a moderation and a varied diet, But yeah, those patterns of overconsumption, whether it's food or whether it's, anything else really, I mean, we're all very much exposed to that all the time, so.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for the update on protein. And we look forward to your next episode.
Thanks so much for having me.
This episode of Living Planet was produced by Jennifer Collins and edited and soundscaped by me, Kathleen Schuster. Our sound engineer was Ziad Abu Sleiman. How has this push for more protein shown up in your life? We want to know, so leave us a recorded voice message at dw.com/livingplanet. It's super easy and fast, and there's no need to download anything. Just hit record. That's dw.com/livingplanet. You can listen back to this and past episodes of Living Planet on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts. And while you're there, be sure to leave us a rating. That's all we have for you this week. Thanks for listening.